Let's talk about the Libertarian Paradox. The paradox discovered by Amartya Sen. It's a really nice illustration of the fact that certain things that we would desire in a social theory or any kind of conception of rational social choice turn out to conflict with each other. We look at certain principles that seem entirely plausible, that seem highly attractive, and they run into conflicts with one another. We can't have everything we want in at least the most obvious way. If we're going to get it, we have to build in some distinctions and be very careful. So let's take a look at the Libertarian Paradox. We'll begin with a plausible interpretation of a libertarian principle. The general idea here is that each of us should be free to make certain decisions for ourselves. We should be able to choose within a certain limited realm. Now, how we define that realm, well, there are different conceptions of that, but for the purposes of our argument, the boundaries of it and the definition of it actually aren't going to make much difference. Here's the basic idea of the libertarian principle I have in mind, something that would say each person ought to have a sphere of liberty, a range of decisions about which others have no say. There ought to be certain things that I get to decide for myself. You don't get to tell me what to do. That's the core idea of the libertarian principle. We don't have to be political libertarians to believe that. All sorts of people think, look, there are certain decisions that are my decisions. I get to choose, and nobody else gets to tell me what to do with respect to such personal decisions. John Stuart Mill advances a principle very much like this in On Liberty. It's often called the harm principle. He says that the only purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. So if I am doing something that injures you or risks injury to you, then yes, you can restrain my behavior. But Mill says as long as my action is what he sometimes refers to as a self-regarding action, something that affects only me, or at least only me to any significant extent, then it turns out that you shouldn't have any say in this. Nobody else should be able to force me to do anything. What I say should go. And so if that's right, harm to others, or at least risk of harm to others, that's something that allows other people to have a say in what I do. But if there is no effect on other people, I should be able to make these decisions for myself. Now that's one way to characterize this sphere of self-regarding actions, actions about which I should have the complete and final say. But we don't have to adopt Mill's rather maximal conception of that in order to believe that there's something to the libertarian principle. There ought to be at least some decisions, however I ought to characterize the sphere of these decisions, that I get to make for myself. So we could frame a libertarian principle this way: for each person there are choices, that a social choice function, a function that says what society as a whole ought to prefer, should respect. It should choose whatever that person chooses. So within certain bounds at least, our social choice function, the function that determines what we together ought to do, should just be what that individual prefers to do. So in other words, the society should prefer whatever the individual prefers with respect to certain things about which that individual has the final say. That implies that however we define it, there should be something like John Stuart Mill's idea of self-regarding actions. Actions about which I get the final say when it involves me, you get the final say when it involves you, and so on. Now there's a second principle that seems plausible. If we're thinking about a social choice function, something that specifies what would be rational for the society as a whole to do, what society ought to prefer, then that should be something that we can characterize for any possible combination of individual preferences, whatever. This is referred to as an unrestricted domain condition. A social choice function should yield a solution for any combination of preferences. In other words, there should be no combination of individual preferences where we just say, tilt. You broke the system. I don't know what to tell you. Now, it might be that sometimes the social choice function says, look, it turns out in these cases, one choice is as good as another. And so it should come up with some solution, even if it's just to say, I don't know, everything looks equally good from my point of view. we have to have a function that is going to tell us, for any combination of individual preferences, what society ought to prefer. That doesn't mean there will be a unique thing. It really might be that the function says, look, in this case, there's just a large range of things, all of which are acceptable, and I'm not going to select any particular one of them. But it will be, one hopes at least, possible to specify, even if it's a set of things, which set is preferred by the group as a whole. Finally, we're going to adopt a principle that is a weak version of a Pareto principle. It says that unanimous choices should go. That is to say that society's preference should match unanimous preferences. If everybody prefers A to B, society should too. So we could frame it this way. This condition says that if everyone prefers one option to another, the social choice function should too. Well, these seem entirely plausible. Each of us should have some sphere of liberty about which we get the final say. A social choice function should come up with some answer, no matter what combination of individual preferences we have, and unanimous choices should prevail. Well, all of those seem plausible, but it turns out there are situations where they come into conflict. And here is Sen's example. We've got two people, Jones and Smith, and a scandalous novel. Let's just say Lady Chatterley's Lover. Jones is rather uptight. Jones would prefer that nobody read a novel like that. He said, look, this is scandalous. I'm not sure what goes on in it, but I've heard things, and so nobody ought to read it. It's bad news. But now, if anybody's going to read it, I'd rather it be me than that character Smith over there. Smith, I don't trust his morals. He's going to be really corrupted by a book like this, whereas I think I could read it. I don't want to, mind you, but I think I could read it and preserve my virtue in the face of such temptations and such lasciviousness. And so Jones says, the best case scenario is nobody reads that book. But if anybody's going to read it, it better be me. I really don't want Smith to be the one who reads it. Now, Smith is a rather, lascivious and easygoing fellow, and he'd like to read the book. He said, shoot, I think it'd be great to read it. But you know what? I actually think that Jones character needs to loosen up. So Smith says, I would rather read it than not read it. But you know what? My first choice is that Jones reads it. He needs to loosen up. He's so uptight. Man, he needs to enjoy life. Maybe something like this will help to, get the juices flowing and get this guy out of his rut. And so Smith's preference is that Jones read the book. Second choice, that Smith himself read it. Last choice, that nobody read it. Well, it seems like a plausible enough scenario. Jones is this uptight character who opposes such literature. Smith supports it, and especially supports it for people who are too uptight like Jones. Well, here's the problem. In a scenario like that, we can't satisfy all of those things we wanted in a social choice function. Why not? First of all, let's think about what the libertarian principle here seems to imply. Let's look first at Jones's preferences. His first choice is that neither one reads the book. His second choice is that he himself reads it. The worst case scenario is that Smith reads it. Now, Jones, we might think, has a choice himself whether or not to read the book, and we should respect his choice. It seems plausible to say choice of whether or not to read a book should be something that's in your sphere of liberty. And if you think it's maybe not, well, substitute something else that is. I mean, the details of the example here don't matter. What does matter is that whatever this choice is, whatever we're talking about, it is within his individual sphere of liberty. So we just say to Jones, look, forget Smith for a minute. Do you want to read the book? And Jones says, well, no. My first choice is that nobody reads that book. I'd certainly rather not read it than read it. So, okay, Jones, don't read it. Okay? So here we get a preference on Jones's part that ought to prevail. Not reading it as opposed to reading it. Now we turn to Smith. We say, well, Smith, you ought to have a choice about whether or not to read this book. After all, the book is something that falls into, let's assume, your sphere of liberty. Do you want to read the book or not? And Smith says, well, yeah, I want to read the book. Sounds great. So here's what happens if we allow the libertarian principle to prevail. Jones doesn't read the book, but Smith does. Seems plausible enough and a reasonable enough outcome. So what's the problem? Well, take a look again at their preferences. Jones says, I'd rather that nobody read that book, but if anybody's going to read it, I'd rather read it than have Smith read it. Smith says, I think it's great. I want people to read the book. My last choice is that nobody reads it. I'd rather read it, but also, I'd really like for Jones to read it. So if we combine those, we think, wait a minute. Jones says, I'd rather read it than have Smith read it. Smith says, I'd rather have Jones read it than myself read it. In other words, both say we should prefer Jones reading it to Smith reading it. Ooh. But the outcome of our libertarian reflections was that Jones is not going to read it, Smith is going to read it. But both of them would prefer, if Smith's going to read it, that Jones read it. We have a problem. In fact, we seem to have a sort of cyclic preference going on here. If we combine these considerations, the weak Pareto principle that says unanimous preferences ought to prevail, and the libertarian principle that says you ought to be able to decide for yourself certain things like whether or not to read the book. And that's surely irrational. We can't have a cyclic social preference that says Jones reading it is better than Smith reading it, and Smith reading it is better than Jones reading it. So we're in trouble. It looks like we have an inconsistency. Both Jones and Smith have other directed preferences. Alan Gibbard refers to these as busybody interests, busybody preferences. They're preferences about what someone else does with their own sphere of liberty. Jones has preferences about Smith reading it. He thinks Smith is corruptible and already largely corrupted and so should not read it. Smith thinks Jones is too uptight and should read it. And so they have interests about what the other person does. And it leads us into this problem. Essentially, we're talking about each having a sphere of liberty on their own right, and that seems plausible. But then we said, aha, we should also respect unanimous preferences. And though unanimity comes from their preferences about what the other person does. And so, hence the clash. You should have the ability to make choices for yourself, but we should respect my preferences about what you do. And when you put it that way, it's just obvious that there's a kind of clash going on. That's the libertarian paradox. Now you might think that we've cheated here, because what I've done is talk about the scenarios where Smith reads it, where Jones reads it, where neither one reads it. You might say, look, there are really four possibilities here. I mean, that both read it, that neither reads it, that only Smith reads it, that only Jones reads it. And so once we frame it that way, we realize, yeah, let's be a little more careful. There are four possibilities. Now, it doesn't change the outcome. We have not cheated, but I want to assure you that that's true. Think through the case involving all four preferences. Jones says, look, I would rather neither one read it, but second choice, I would rather that I alone read it, because I want to keep it out of Smith's hands. Last choice is that I don't read it and Smith does, because he's so corruptible, I won't understand the way in which he's being corrupted. So my third choice is actually that both of us read it. I don't want to do it, but I would really like to know what's going into his head, and so I better read it. Last choice is that he alone reads it and I don't. Now Jones has then other directed preferences. Not only preferences about what he reads, but preferences about what Smith reads. Smith has exactly the same kind of other directed preferences, because Smith's preferences go this way. He says, look, my first choice is that Jones reads it. I'd like to read it, he says, but if it's going to be one of us, it ought to be Jones. And really, I think it would loosen him up. He probably won't read it if I read it, because he'll think, suspect, because that Smith character's reading it. So my first choice is that I don't read it. I forgo reading it, and Jones does read it. My second choice, since I'd like to read it, is, yes, that we both read it. My third choice would be that I alone read it. I would enjoy it, but man, that Smith guy, he needs it. And then my last choice is that neither reads it. Well, again, we get the same libertarian point. Hey, Jones, do you want to read it or not? No. Smith, do you want to read it or not? Yes. And so it looks like if we respect the libertarian principle, we get Smith reading it and Jones not reading it. But look at the unanimity. If we consider that, we say, wait a minute, both have the following preferences. Jones reading it, Jones alone, in other words, reading it, is better than both reading it, and that's better than Smith alone reading it. And so we've got unanimous judgments that Jones reading it is better than both, that's better than Smith reading it. They really only disagree about whether neither reading it is either the first choice or the last choice. That violates the outcome of our deliberations about the libertarian principle. We said, look, each of you guys just decide whether or not to read it. Smith would read it, Jones wouldn't. But now we say, but wait a minute. Jones reading it, Jones alone reading it, is unanimously preferred to both reading it, and that's unanimously preferred to Smith alone reading it. There's an advantage to thinking of it in terms of all four options, because once we do, we realize that there is a kind of game theoretic situation going on here. In fact, it's easy to express this in the normal form of a game. The result of that, where you've got partial agreement but partial sharp disagreement, that's characteristic of prisoners' dilemmas. It's characteristic, for that matter, of other kinds of game theoretic situations that we know cause problems. I think once we see that this has the structure of a certain kind of game, we realize, aha, there is a relationship between these problems about either failure to reach any equilibrium at all, or about suboptimal equilibria, and the kind of paradoxical situation that brings out the clash between the libertarian principle and the Pareto principle. Another way to reflect on this, of course, is to say, well, the principles do clash. So what do we say? We could just say there's certain combinations of individual preferences where we really just get a broken social choice function and give up our unrestricted domain condition. We could say the libertarian principle is false, but that seems surprising, given that, after all, it seems pretty plausible that there are certain things you ought to be able to decide for yourself. And finally, we could say sometimes unanimous preferences don't prevail. And yet that too seems strange. Come on, everybody agrees that this is better than that. So why are we ending up with that inferior situation? What this tells us, I think, putting these insights together, is that a libertarian principle is extremely plausible, but it also yields sometimes suboptimal outcomes. It may be that those equilibria are inevitable anyway for other reasons. But I think it's an interesting point that even a very weak, very limited libertarian idea that each of us should get to make certain kinds of choices for ourselves leads us, socially, to some suboptimal outcomes.